Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Well, here we are again, for yet another episode of Strange as It Seems. And what are we going to be talking about today? Well, I'm sure people who have listened to the episodes have noticed that the word occult tends to show up a lot. We found that tends to be fairly popular. It always tends to attract attention. So I'm going to tell you ahead of time that you'll notice in today's thumbnail that the word occult does not appear. Rather, we're talking about, but don't worry. If you want some woo-woo, there will be a little bit of woo-woo in there. And we're talking about Russia, after all, and you're never that far away from woo-woo. So, the basic subject today is the murder of the Russian imperial family in 1918. And some people may be thinking, hasn't everything that could possibly be said about already been said? Well, no. Okay, that's true for just about anything, I suppose. But what we're going to be focusing on here, I think, are some unexplored or underexplored avenues about it. And, there are still some basic questions that need, answers. We're not necessarily going to supply those answers, but we're going to explore what's there. And the basic question is, who killed them? And by that, I mean not the individuals. I can give you the name, as we'll see, of the fellow who led the team of executioners who shot them. In fact, you could even compile a fairly accurate list of all of the dozen or so gunmen that were there on that particular night. But that's, of course, not who actually gave the order. Now, whether that order came down from the highest levels of the Soviet government, did that order come from Lenin? Did it come from Lenin's chief lieutenant, Yakov Sverdlov? Did it come from just the members of the Ural Soviet? Well, that's one of the things which is still unclear. So we're going to try to walk through the whole incident, the whole affair, to see if we can figure out where the indications lead, where the finger of guilt points.
Okay.
But then the other question comes down, maybe the more important one always, is opposed to who or what, is why. Why were Nicholas and Alexandra and their children and the family servants, and by the way, 3 out of their 4 dogs, killed on the 17th of July, 1918. That also may help explain who. If you know the why, if you know the motive, you can get a bit closer to the culprit in this case. But we're also going to look at a question which inevitably comes up and which really still hangs around the whole assassination of the Russian imperial family, and that's, were they all killed or were there survivors? Now today, that is from the standpoint of 2025, that question seems to be pretty firmly put to rest. And that's because the discovery of the remains of all the known family members and DNA tests performed on those remains seem to have confirmed, to all but a sum, that the entire family was killed, at least on or about the same time, in July 1918. But for decades, in fact, well up even to the beginning of the 21st century, there were those who claimed that there were members, most notoriously, I suppose, Anastasia, the youngest daughter, but also Alexei, the boy, the Tsarevich, that they had survived. And there were numerous people over the years who claimed to be them. There are others of the sisters. The Grand Duchess Tatiana also appears in various forms, various people impersonating her. And we can say pretty clearly now that those were all impersonations, but that again goes back to the question of why were there impersonators? I mean, were these just sort of crazy people who decided that they were the Grand Duchess Anastasia? Or was there some, dare I use the term, conspiracy behind that? Did somebody else put them up to it? And again, it goes back to the question of why. So without giving too much away up front, I'll say that if you hang around to the end, you'll see how the question of why the family was killed is directly connected, I think, to why subsequent imposters emerged. If not all of them, then certainly some of them. So I guess the other thing we ought to add in here is the usual appeal is that if you're listening and you like what you're hearing, to hit the like button. And if you want to hear more, subscribe. That's always helpful. The number of subscriptions has gratifyingly gone up to a modest degree, but if it continues to, it's the same YouTube and podcast appeal. You know the drill. So let's.
It's good for my justification for, hey, let's get a beer. So
yes,
every time it goes up 100 subscribers, they get a beer.
Yes. Okay. So we have to keep Stephen in beer. So I may as well. So please help. Please help in that regard. Okay. So, I did say that while the occult, things woo-woo for lack of a better term, I like that term actually, don't figure too prominently in this episode, I want to begin with some speculation by a French Romanian. He's usually termed an esoteric philosopher who died not long ago, a fellow by the name of Jean Parvulescu. Original name was Parvulescu. Jean Parvulescu was born in Romania, escaped not long after the communists took over after World War II, made his way to France, and earned a name for himself as a kind of figure on the esoteric, that is, occultish French right wing. So there is a kind of ideological bent to Parvulescu. So needless to say, he didn't view the Soviet experiment and Russian Revolution in a particularly positive light. So take that is an indication of where his comments are coming from, but they're always fairly interesting. And one of the things that Parvulescu wondered is whether or not at the root of the revolution itself, there was more at work than just ideology and politics, that there was more here than just the working out of dialectical materialism. And that, in fact, he wondered that there might have been, well, the old term dark forces at work, that there was something arcane, and that these dark forces at work in the Russian Revolution weren't aiming just at regime change or a dictatorship of the proletariat, but were actually a part of a kind of grand alchemical transmutation of history, not just of a nation, but of history, of reality itself, by introducing a new reality. And to that extent, he actually wondered whether the whole Soviet experiment was a kind of vast ritual to bring about that alchemical transmutation. In particular, he focused on the mass murder of the Romanov family in 1918, and also speculated whether or not it was in some way what he called the fulfillment of obligations, secret obligations. And he also went on to label Lenin as a high-ranking initiate in the hierarchy of negative, completely infernal, super-historical, extra-human, and highly anti-human forces. I'm not even sure what that means, but it's bad.
Right.
And again, The whole idea here is that there is more involved in the revolution than merely politics, and in particular socialist materialism. But this again was the creation of a new type of regime with a new ideology, which aimed at a general reformation of the world, an alchemical transmutation of politics and of the world itself and reality. And that the murder of the Romanovs, beyond simply getting rid of the members of a defunct regime, was part of that process, that it was in fact a sacrifice, a necessary ritual sacrifice that had to be performed as part of this transmutation. Now, I want to keep in mind that I'm not in any way insisting that that was the case, because no matter how much you believe it, you can't prove it. But it's interesting, I simply put forward that that allegation or interpretation has been made, so let's get into the weeds and see how that works out. So one of the first things about the murder of the Romanovs is that, the basic story seems to be pretty simple. Nicholas abdicated the Russian throne in March 1917. Again, for the uninitiated, he was not overthrown by the Bolsheviks. Lenin and his crew had nothing whatsoever to do with the toppling of Nicholas's reign. That had to do with a conspiracy within Nicholas's own political and military elite, who'd basically decided that he was a loser and a liability, and they wished to replace him in order to pursue the war successfully. And he was basically, it was really not a popular revolution. It was a coup d'etat organized by people around him, in many ways people that he had trusted. He abdicated for himself and his son, the Tsarevich Alexei, and with that, more or less passed into the captivity of the new government, which called itself the Provisional Government. So here you're going to have to point out that between the end of the monarchy and the advent of the Soviet regime in November 1917, for about 8 months, there is another regime, which is usually called the Provisional or Temporary Government. And that was a government largely dominated by moderate socialists and some Russian liberals. Alexander Kerensky, one of those moderate socialists, becomes the key figure. He's the guy that Lenin will actually overthrow in November. So one of the first things that the provisional regime had to decide was, what are we going to do with the old emperor, with the old Tsar, and the rest of his family? And there was also the whole question about what exactly becomes of the monarchy. So now here's a little point that's often forgotten. The Romanov family, the whole imperial family, which was much larger than just Nicholas, Alexandra, and their offspring. So Nicholas had uncles, aunts, cousins, the whole family, I think, together. And most of those people held the title of Grand Duke or Grand Duchess. And if you could go through the whole process, you could simply pass the throne down to others. He had brothers. So when Nicholas abdicated in his name and for his son, that then left the throne to Nicholas's brother, Michael, or Mikhail. He became the Tsar. Well, the throne was his. So Michael never formally accepted the throne. He, in fact, was kind of down with the revolution that had overthrown his brother. I mean, he would appear in public with a red cockade on his hat, which said something. Shades of the French Revolution, and nobles doing that type of thing. So Michael never accepted the throne, nor did he reject it. So the monarchy goes into a kind of limbo. But the important point here is that with the abdication of Nicholas, and that including his 13, 14-year-old son, the monarchy still existed, and the crown, should it be taken up, now belonged to his brother. So, in that sense, Nicholas no longer matters in the imperial succession. And there really wasn't a huge... he had his loyalists. There were people who still felt that he had been unfairly dethroned. He doesn't really seem, he kind of accepts his fate, if not willingly. He goes along with it. There are those who have argued that having been removed from the position of power, he was maybe a happier man than he'd ever been. He was basically a family man that liked photography. That's what he would have been. If he hadn't been Tsar of Russia, he could have been a photographer and might have been much happier in that case. And that's one of the simple way to describe Nicholas, I think, is that he certainly had his faults. He was a very bad emperor, but he was not a bad man. He was, in many ways, a fairly kind of decent individual. And now he was out of the limelight, which he had never really wanted, which had been foisted upon him. But he's not the center of things anymore. And there wasn't some kind of huge political movement to return him to the throne. Mm. He had been rejected by his own elite. That is, the members of the Russian parliament, the members of the main political parties, even many of his generals. The army did not rally to him. Mm. And that's why he fell. If you longer have the army on your side, you're not going to be overthrown. And in his case, I think of his major military commanders, only one actually offered to help him.
So, half the reason I've been quiet so far is because my expertise is not Russian history, so I'm more than happy to cede the floor. But for context, I always think of myself as being the voice for the audience. For context, I'm just curious, what did the elite want other than Nicholas?
Well, the main thing to keep in mind is there's a war on.
Right.
So Russia's at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary and Turkey. Primarily Germany is their main opponent, and the war has not gone well. So by the time you reach the early part of 1917, the Russian army isn't poorly armed. In fact, it was probably better armed in early 1917 than it had been previously. And they actually managed to overcome a lot of these shortages they'd had early on. But psychologically, it's teetering on the edge of collapse. Nicholas, I think in many ways he'd done his best, but the war had, there were a lot more defeats than there were victories. The victories, such as they were, keep in mind this is World War I, were costly and ephemeral. There was also the whole scandal involving his, and in particular his wife Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin. Mm-hmm. And Rasputin had been murdered at the very end of December 1916. And that was really, and that too was, Rasputin isn't murdered by revolutionaries. Rasputin is murdered by Russian monarchists, people who felt that they were trying to uphold the honor of Russia and the monarchy against the kind of foul influence of this obscene character of Rasputin, which is where he gets most of his bad reputation. So in a way, he was kind of blamed as a bad influence. There had always been plenty of people in the court and elsewhere who had never liked Alexandra, who was, of course, German directly in origin, so her loyalty had always been questioned. And, Nicholas was in the worst position for a leader, and particularly a monarch, I guess. See, he had led the country into war, and that war was being lost. And he becomes the sacrificial victim to attend for that, and his removal from the throne. Also, the British and French allies of Russia had lost all confidence in him as well. One of the things that had undermined his credibility with the British and the French were not wholly untrue rumors of secret peace feelers between Russia and Germany. Those did exist. They never really seemed to have gone much of anywhere. But that gave the idea, and that's actually why Rasputin is killed, and why it's the British who organized his assassination, because they felt that he was a tool of the Germans trying to lure Nicholas into a separate peace. So Nicholas seemed to be a focus of defeat, and he seemed to be compromised, and so he was removed from the throne, and in some ways, he could have argued that was perhaps the best thing and the worst thing that had ever happened to him. So the whole family was basically taken into custody by the new provisional government, and they were held at different palaces, but they were eventually moved, I think in the summer of 1917, away from St. Petersburg, which was then the capital, and they're moved far into Siberia to the provincial town of Tobolsk, which is pretty much the middle of nowhere. And there they would remain for months, living pretty happily, but under guard. So keep in mind they're under a kind of house arrest during this period, and there's still this question even in the provisional government is, what are we going to do with this guy? And this is when the first idea comes up about putting the ex-Tsar on trial. That's what we can do. This is a way we can kind of establish the credibility of the new regime, because we'll put the leader of the old regime on trial. And he, again, also this concept, almost a show trial, is something which is a kind of public sacrifice. You know, when the victims, rightly or wrongly, are drugged forward, accused of their crimes, and then assigned their punishment. But nothing really ever came of that idea. And part of it, I suppose, is that Kerensky and the other members of the provisional government now found out that having taken over control of the country in the war, they had to run it, and it wasn't going any better for them. In fact, things were progressively getting worse and worse. And by the time you get to the summer of 1917, so Nicholas resigns in March, and then by the time you get to July and August, Kerensky tries to revive the war effort, and it is a total failure. And the army begins to disintegrate, and the Bolsheviks gain more and more backing and boldness, and finally in November will strike and carry out their own coup d'etat, and then conclude a separate peace with Germany. That's how they will eventually happen. So if the idea was to prevent a separate peace between Russia and Germany by getting rid of Nicholas, that was an utter failure. In fact, what you did, this is the way history works, by removing him, you not only didn't prevent it, you actually set off the chain of events that brought it into being. Okay. Think of it this way. You manifest the very thing you sought to avoid. Through your actions. The law of unintended consequences. But that idea of putting Nicholas on trial is always kind of hanging around there. And now with Lenin and the Bolsheviks in control, well, now they've got to run things. So they're not going to run the war. They're going to bug out of it. They're going to simply remove themselves from it. But now they find themselves the custodians of Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, their son, and the 4 dogs. Plus the various family servants, doctors, and other maids who remained with them. The whole Romanov group, I think, is 11 people. So here again, the Bolsheviks have lots of problems. Part of that is fighting off counter-revolutionaries at every end, trying to make a peace deal with the Germans to end the war. They've got all kinds of problems to deal with. So for some months, not until we get to around April 1918, does Lenin really seem to turn around to trying to figure out what we're going to do with these people. And the idea then comes up that we can bring him to Moscow and we can create a trial. And he will be presented as the enemy of the Russian people. And it should be said that Lenin never had a single good thing to say about Nicholas. He considered him to be a crowned brigand. That was one description of him. The successor to 300 years of oppression and disgrace. So the idea of having Nicholas shot as a symbol was perfectly within. There's nothing that would argue that that Lenin would have found that to be morally unacceptable. But the whole question came about the timing of it. But there was another issue, and that was, and this is something that Kerensky had also supposedly considered before when the provisional government was thinking about this. What if we put Nicholas on trial and he actually, because now you're making a public display about it, and what if this actually gains him sympathy in a certain way? because Nicholas physically wasn't this kind of large ogre type of guy. He was a fairly mild manner, and many would describe it fairly likable. So things can backfire that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're going to try to bring a person into the public forum and present them as an ogre and a villain.
Right.
But those observing it don't see that. What they see would be a man who was in many ways kind of, you know, just incompetent and a non-entity.
Right.
So it could backfire. And that, I think, is probably the main reason that Lenin and his cronies never really wanted to go through with the trial. Well, the whole idea of a trial was iffy to begin with. But there's still the question of what do we do? So one of the things that happens in April 1918 is that the whole sort of process, the ball gets rolling. When the decision is made by Lenin and his chief lieutenants to move the family from Tobolsk in western Siberia and move them a bit closer to Moscow and St. Petersburg by bringing them to the Ural town of Yekaterinburg. Now, here again, there are kind of interesting questions, because you can often get the impression, if you look at these events, that somehow the Romanov family is trapped in Yekaterinburg because they don't leave there. But that's never the case. The train lines were open. You know, as I go on to describe things, I want you to notice that there are people who are constantly moving back and forth between Moscow, where the Bolsheviks will relocate the capital around the same time. So that becomes the center of everything. So there are people going back and forth on trains between Yekaterinburg and Moscow. So it was very simple. All you had to do, whether or not you were going to put them on trial, was to put them on a train and take them to Moscow. It was that easy, but they never do. They're moved from Tobolsk, about 400 miles, to Yekaterinburg, and there they will remain. In fact, it seems to have been very, very important for Lenin to gather as many of the Romanov family as he could. Remember, there are lots of other Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses and Prince and Princesses out there, and a lot of them, including Mikhail, his brother, the ostensible Tsar, is also arrested in March 1918 and taken to the same neck of the woods, not to Yekaterinburg, but I think to the nearby town of Alapayevsk. So he's held captive separately. So if you look at what's going on, the Bolsheviks seem to be deliberately gathering together captive members of the imperial family and all kind of relocating them to this area of the Urals. Nicholas, Alexandra, and family in Yekaterinburg, Mikhail in Alapayevsk, or actually I think he may be in Perm, which is the kind of capital. It's where the Ural Regional Soviet has its headquarters there, and that's kind of the local Soviet government. And that's not accidental. So again, why do you arrest one person in St. Petersburg and then move them to this remote area and move someone from a more remote area to this, so that they're kind of being gathered? And the key thing, it seems to me, is that they're all being collected in areas that are under the authority of the Ural Regional Soviet. Now, why would that be the case? There were regional Soviets elsewhere in the country, but one of the things about the Ural Regional Soviet is that it was seen as being quite loyal and ferociously revolutionary, dependable.
Okay.
There were people in control of the Bolshevik administration in that area, including Yekaterinburg, who were trustworthy revolutionaries who could be counted upon to obey orders, and that was not true elsewhere. Also, it had the advantage of sort of being out of sight. So this is why I would argue is why they weren't killed in Moscow, or why they weren't killed in St. Petersburg, or in any other sort of main population center, because out of sight was to some degree out of mind. They, for months, the whole family kind of disappeared out into the woods, and they were still barely out of that. But you now got them together in a fairly isolated area, not too many people around, under the control of reliable minions who would probably do whatever they were told. So that gets us to why, and the imperial family itself, that is Nicholas, Alexandra, the kids, they're actually sent in 2 different batches. So they don't go from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg all at the same time. So I think initially it's in late April that Nicholas, Alexandra, and one of the daughters, Tatiana, arrive. It's not until almost a month later that Anastasia, Alexei, Olga, and Maria and the rest of the family show up. And it's not clear also why they're kind of separated into 2 different groups. I might speculate that there might have been an additional idea of sort of isolating Nicholas and the parents separately and killing them. That might have been an idea, but eventually it's not until May that they're all gathered together in this place. So this is where things, though, get a little strange. And not necessarily in a woo-woo sort of way, but it all depends on how you would want to interpret that. So the Bolsheviks' plan, and by that we mean a plan approved by Lenin, the guy at the top. He was quite aware of this. The power structure at this time is Lenin, who is the boss of the regime, but his right-hand man, the second most important person in the Bolshevik hierarchy in this period, is Yakov Sverdlov. Not Stalin, not even Trotsky, but Sverdlov. And today, nobody much talks about Sverdlov because he died under questionable circumstances in 1919. So he dies fairly early on. Had he lived on, there might never have been much of a place for a Stalin or a Trotsky as long as Sverdlov was around, which might give you an idea as to those questionable circumstances in his demise. But those are the 2 key, at the top, the real decision makers were Lenin and Sverdlov. And Sverdlov had the confidence of Lenin, and he also had the wherewithal to make decisions on his own. I mean, really, I don't think Yakov Sverdlov would ever have ordered the execution of any of the Romanovs without Lenin's okay. But it's conceivable that that could have happened. That Lenin could simply have entrusted, it's just you handle it. Take care of it. I don't need to know the details. And this brings us to an essential point, is that there's no clear paper trail about this. I mean, what you don't have, what does not exist, is a letter, a telegram, an order of any kind bearing Lenin's name or signature, which orders the execution of any of the Romanovs. That has never been found. Now, supposedly, there was a telegram that came from Moscow, according to some of the Bolsheviks later on who were involved in the assassination, that had either Sverdlov's or Lenin's name attached, but that has never been found. But that's one of the things, again, that it's one of those, a not uncommon predicament in historical situations. Because it goes back to this idea that there's a piece of paper to explain everything. Yes, that the truth exists in the archives because every document in an archive is authentic and true, and it can't be other than that because it's a primary document, which is clearly not the case. All right, they're full of things that are wrong and incorrect. Let's pause for a moment while the dogs.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, back to it. Or not.
No, not yet.
Okay, now we.
So, all the truth is not hidden somewhere in the archives because very often, well, it's a very simple thing, particularly if you're involved in something which is, shall we say, incriminating, conspiratorial, illegal, immoral, whatever term you want to attach to it. Don't leave a paper trail.
Right.
Okay. I cannot emphasize, not this, of course, this would be wrong to do it to begin with, but if you do, don't write it down. Okay. Don't leave evidence that can then be presented in the court of law or the court of history against you.
That's
Give essential orders verbally.
That's
all you have to do.
I never understood why people are so obsessed with the JFK stuff, because I'm like, do you think they really wrote that down? You think there's any...
You think you're going to release all these records and there's going to be the smoking gun laying around there all these years that no one else has ever gone through that, and they're not going to eliminate? It doesn't prove there were ever incriminating documents to begin with, but the absence, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah.
All right.
The only time I've found archives to have incriminating stuff is when they didn't think it was incriminating at the time. Yeah. So.
But if you're going to order the murder of the imperial family, you don't have to do that. Lenin had a perfectly reliable sidekick, Sverdlov, and all he had to do was to say, we need to take care of this thing. It's a bit like a mafia don giving an order. Vito, I need you to take care of this thing in Jersey for me.
Hey.
Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, I got it. It's okay. Okay. I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
And it will be carried out to your satisfaction. So, another example I give to that is the question that sometimes comes up is that, everyone, well, the general assumption, I think correctly in history, is that Adolf Hitler ordered the Holocaust.
Oh.
That it could not, you'll get these, you've got the David Irvings out there who argue that somehow this all transpired without him knowing about it, which seems to be highly unlikely.
Yeah.
But there is no order of any kind bearing his name or signature which orders any kind of mass extermination of Jews or anyone else. Yet these things occurred in a regime under his personal control. Mm-hmm. And here again, I think it was just a matter that the intention was understood and verbally communicated.
Yeah.
That there didn't need to, that the most important orders aren't written down. They don't have to be in this case. So, but here's what I think introduces a certain element of strangeness to this. So, the Bolsheviks have isolated Nicholas, Alexandra, and the family, and other members of the Romanov extended family in this same area. That seems to be suspiciously intentional. And they're not sure what exactly they're going to do with them. And the question now comes up, did they do this by they, I mean Lenin, Sverdlov, primarily, had they already decided by April that they were going to kill them? Or are they still parking them in Yekaterinburg trying to figure out what they were going to do? So the actual killings will take place on the night of the 16th and 17th of July. But a curious thing is that beginning in late June, that is almost a month earlier, reports of the execution generally of Nicholas, but also sometimes other members of the family, begin to appear in the Western press. So, for instance, on the 25th of June, 1918, and for continuing for the better part of a week following, in the American press, there are newspaper accounts supposedly emanating from Russia from unknown sources, but they've now found their way into Western papers, saying that Nicholas Romanov, late Tsar of all the Russias, had been killed by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg. These reports, the earliest one of these reports seems to be traced back to Copenhagen, which then also before that seems to have gotten it by some sort of vague news out of Russia. Other similar reports, almost identical, saying that the Tsar had been shot in Yekaterinburg, appear in Amsterdam. One appears in Berlin, another one in Geneva, and another in Stockholm. One of the stories says that the Bolsheviks sent Red Guards into his house and they shot him there. Others say that he was given some sort of perfunctory trial before he was executed. And others say he wasn't even shot. In fact, in one of the stories, he's just bayoneted. But he's repeatedly reported as being dead. In some of the stories, not most of them, the Tsar's son, Alexei, is either said to have been shot at the same time or to have died of natural causes, basically the hemophilia he suffered from, a few days later. But one of the things that's conspicuous in this is that none of these stories mention anything being done to the ex-Tsarina Alexandra or the 4 daughters. They're not mentioned as being touched in any of these stories. So, and on the 29th of June, in the Amsterdam report, it reported as seemingly an absolute fact that the Tsar had been executed. But on that same day in Berlin, there was a news story, also quoting unnamed sources, that said that he had. I have to reverse myself. The Amsterdam story actually denied that he had been executed. But on the same day in Berlin, there was a story that absolutely insisted that he had been executed. So it's not a clear picture at all. And then on the 4th of July, 1918, in London, there was another article that declared that the Tsar's death couldn't be confirmed or denied, but they seemed to be pretty sure that he was dead, that he had been executed as well. And 2 days after that, there was another report, again supposedly coming out of Russia, that the Tsar and the Tsarina and one of the daughters, Tatiana, had been killed, but that the rest of the family was apparently still alive. So what you've got here is an inconsistent picture, other than in most of these, Nicholas is clearly singled out as being executed. Sometimes there are other members of the family, but mostly not. Now, keep that in mind, because when we get towards the end of the story, I want to come back to what it was that after the actual killings, the Bolshevik government reported, and how similar or dissimilar that from what was coming up in these incorrect news, because the Romanovs are still alive in this period, but their death is being foretold. And it's a curious type of thing, where these stories are appearing in different places, all from vague sources, so it's never clear where this information is emanating from. But the story keeps coming up again and again, and keep in mind, this is, in fact, a kind of prophecy of what's going to happen. So here's the question to consider. Why are these deaths being prophesized before they happen, or why are they being advertised before they happen, and who's doing that?
Yeah.
What is the reason? Now, there's an American reporter, a journalist by the name of Herman Bernstein. Interesting guy. Gets involved in all kinds of things. But in this, Herman Bernstein, in fact, was born in Russia. He's of Russian Jewish background. He is no great admirer of Nicholas or the Romanov regime. But one of the things that he finds is that he was quite aware. He'd been collecting stories about the movement of Nicholas and his family to Yekaterinburg. And Bernstein makes a kind of prediction of his own. He's firmly convinced that the Bolsheviks had moved Nicholas and family to Yekaterinburg with the express intent of killing them there. And Bernstein, again, seems to have vague sources that were telling him that, yes, once they're there, they're all going to be killed. Now, what was really going on in the background? So they're not dead yet. In fact, by the time all of these, all of these predictions of the death, some of these go up. I think there are news stories of the executions into early July. So these things go on for some weeks. So what was actually taking place was that in Moscow, where the Soviet government had relocated itself, Sverdlov, Lenin's lieutenant, found a suitable lieutenant of his own, a fellow by the name of Philip Golishokhin. And Golishokhin became his go-between with Yekaterinburg. So he sent Golishokhin to Yekaterinburg, and also to the town of Perm, where the regional Soviet had its headquarters. And As the later story was reconstructed, Goloshokin's job was to deal with the Romanov problem. And Goloshokin would later say that he was given the order to go there to, among the local Bolsheviks, find reliable people and organize the murders. And Goloshokin found a local Bolshevik, Chekist by the name of Yakov Yurovsky, sometimes called Yankel Yurovsky. And Yurovsky seemed to be... So now you've got... Okay, you have Lenin,
Right.
who has his right-hand man, who, let's say, he assigned, you take care of this.
Right.
Sverdlov is busy in Moscow. He can't go, so he gets Goloshokin as his man, a reliable figure who will carry it out. And Goloshokin, who's going back and forth between Yekaterinburg and Moscow, locally gets Yurovsky to actually organize the killings. You're going to recruit some people.
Yeah.
And by the way, we need this done before Yekaterinburg is evacuated. Well, what's all that about? Well, one of the things that often comes into the story is that, remember, the Bolsheviks were fighting off various enemies on all fronts. White Guards, that is, Russians who were opposed to the regime and had taken arms against it, generally referred to, whatever they were, as White Guards. But then something else that had happened in this very region of the Urals is that a foreign military unit, the Czechoslovak Legion, there's a whole story there. How am I going to describe this? All right. In the course of the war, tens of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks had deserted the Austro-Hungarian army, or they had been taken prisoner by the Russians. And then they had been organized into a military force to fight against the Austrians and Germans. And this became the Czechoslovak Army Corps. Fairly large, well-trained unit. And what the Czechoslovaks wanted to do is they wanted to get out of Russia and they wanted to go to the Western Front and continue the war because Russia had now left the war. And the Bolsheviks weren't really keen on this and tried to disarm them. And then in May of 1918, the Czechoslovaks rebelled. They simply refused to obey the Soviet government and began to seize trains and towns along the Trans-Siberian Railway with the idea of fighting their way out, reaching Vladivostok, and eventually reaching Western Europe, which they would, but it would take a long time. So now there's this rebellion in the Urals region, not too far from Yekaterinburg. So the story that you often hear is that, well, the Czechs rebelled and they were joined by the Russian White Guards and they were all marching on Yekaterinburg and the Bolsheviks couldn't get the imperial family out of Yekaterinburg. So they shot them so that the Czechs and the Whites couldn't get them and then proclaim Nicholas emperor again. Okay, it makes a good story, but it's not true. The main thing against it is that, again, the Romanovs are not trapped in Yekaterinburg. Remember, Goloshokin is constantly going back and forth. He could have taken them with him anytime he had wanted to. They're deliberately keeping them there. And the Czechs and the White Guards aren't making a beeline for Yekaterinburg. They're gradually sort of advancing in that direction. But they're still a week away when the Romanovs will be killed. So after their death, it's another week before the Czechs and the Whites ever reached Yekaterinburg. So there was never any point in time in which the imperial family was, from the Bolshevik standpoint, were in danger of falling into the hands of the Whites and the Czechs, because that could have been prevented at any time by just sticking them on a train and heading them west. That direction is never closed off.
Was that even something that they talked about wanting to do, was reinstall?
And well, even that, I mean, there's no really large monarchist movement in Russia at this point. I mean, the monarchy was, this is it. Nicholas was seen even by supporters of the monarchy as a bungler and a loser.
Yeah.
All right. This was a guy who had not managed the war. There had always been issues with his handling of things. He had never been seen by many people as a particularly strong character. He was a weak czar. And among the professed monarchists who killed Rasputin, Why did they kill Rasputin? Because Nicholas was too weak to get rid of him. Nicholas was so weak and ineffective that he had allowed this, degenerate to infiltrate the imperial. So that's what they thought of him. So in many cases, they would have much rather have had Mikhail
right.
as the head of the government. And there were plenty of other, there were lots of Romanovs around. There were Grand Dukes.
Well, you're telling me this, and that's why I find the whole issue around him curious, because it seemed like nobody really wanted him. Nobody was interested in bringing him back.
No. See, you've gotten the key. Yeah. Nicholas, at this point, is a political non-entity.
Yeah.
He was not popular. Even among those who wanted to restore the Romanov monarchy, he would not have probably been their first choice.
So he didn't really have any power. Like people, he wasn't like Napoleon, where it's like, well, if Napoleon comes back, he's gonna...
Nicholas wasn't sitting in Yekaterinburg like Napoleon on Elba, waiting for the 100 days to come along. I mean, if anything, I think he was glad to be out of it.
Yeah.
I don't even know, had he been offered the throne again, as to whether he would have been willing to take it. His life was simply much simpler. But again, keep that in mind. He's not politically important. There is no huge organized monarchist force which is trying to put him on the throne. Even the monarchists among the whites who are marching on Yekaterinburg, they're not doing that in order to liberate the former czar and restore him to the throne. That wasn't the danger. Which then brings up the interesting question. If he's not really a political danger, then why bother with him at all?
Yeah.
Okay, why make this big deal out of it? What other factor might have been involved, and why was it necessary that they be killed? Now, there were, behind the scenes, in terms of international diplomacy, a kind of secret diplomacy, there were feelers from the West, from various places, of either trying to ransom or rescue the imperial family. So keep in mind, Nicholas is a cousin to King George. He's related to most of the other crowned heads. And, monarchs tend to stick together to some degree. And that, in fact, was one of the possibilities. There was an idea which was floated as to whether or not Britain would accept the imperial family as refugees, whether a deal would be made. I think the talks for this actually began during the provisional regime, but I believe that they went on. And here, Nicholas is, he was essentially dumped by his own cousin, King George, the guy who he so famously resembled. This is where you see the picture of them together, and which is the czar and which is the king. And there was some idea that, yes, we monarchs should stick together. And after all, he is my cousin and we're all descendants of Queen Victoria. And we should help them by bringing them here. But then there was supposedly the fellow who nixed that was British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who went to the king and said, look, the czar is an unpopular and reactionary figure. To much of the British public, he is a discredited political figure. Yeah. And he's also widely seen as a symbol of reaction and extremism. And for instance, our Labour politicians would never put up with this. So to give the dethroned czar sanctuary in England could have profound negative political repercussions for your own monarchy. So leave him to his fate.
Okay.
And that was done. So monarchs, crowned heads don't necessarily have that. If their throne is threatened, you're on your own. There were efforts by the Germans. Remember the Kaiser? This is another one of his shirt tail relatives, of bringing him in, trying to rescue them, perhaps as part of the Brest-Litovsk peace that was established an end to hostilities between Imperial Germany and Russia, but that never gets included. The Germans eventually don't care enough to do that. There was, and this does kind of figure back into what's going to happen, there was a kind of half-baked British scheme, initiated by who, it is not clear, to carry out a rescue in Yekaterinburg. And years later, there was a British intelligence operative in Russia at the time by the name of Stephen Alley. A very resourceful guy. Stephen Alley claimed, among other things, that he was at once given the job of assassinating Stalin, but didn't carry it out. But Alley was in Russia undercover, and he's around Yekaterinburg, and he actually has agents who are watching, who are keeping the imperial family under observation. Now, in Yekaterinburg, the whole imperial family and their retinue are being held in a particular house. It used to belong to an engineer, a wealthy engineer by the name of Nikolai Ipatiev. And so it's called the Ipatiev House. And it had been confiscated or requisitioned by the local Soviet authorities, and that was now the house in which the imperial family and their servants were held. Alley had the house under observation. There was a Bolshevik guard. Local Red Guards were assigned to this. And this was essentially the command that Yurovsky was in control of. Alley had some sort of plan of the idea of spiriting them off in the middle of the night and trying to get them out of the area and up to the far north, possibly to Archangel, where they could then be put aboard a British ship and taken somewhere. Norway, who knows?
Yeah.
Simply get them out of Russia. But according to Alley, he called that off because he came to realize that his operation had been penetrated by the Bolsheviks. That he was spying on the Romanovs, but he was being spied on himself, and he simply decided it would be certain death, both for the Romanovs and for all of his men, if they attempted to do this. So that abortive rescue operation went nowhere. Supposedly. Well, we're going to come back to that, because some would argue that no, Alley wasn't telling the whole truth about this. So there were these half-baked schemes to either ransom them or to rescue them, but none of this goes anywhere. And in the meantime, Goloshokin comes back to Yekaterinburg after a couple of other visits, and I think this is around the 13th of July. 13th or 14th of July, just a few days ahead of that. No, actually, he comes back the last time on the 15th. He's there around the 10th, and he comes back on the 15th. And he now tells Yurovsky that the executions have to be carried out within 24 hours. And everything has to be cleaned up. All the evidence has to be removed before the town is evacuated a week later. So remember I said that the Czechs were not in
right.
They weren't like lurking in the trees ready to come into town. The Bolsheviks, it's a week later, and it's a rather leisurely evacuation of the town, which the Bolsheviks simply pull out of. So there's no great hurry. But on the 15th, Goloshokin comes and tells Yurovsky, you got 24 hours to wrap this up. Yurovsky had recruited, I think he initially said I'm not sure he's counting himself among this, but let's say a dozen gunmen as part of the execution squad. In other words, a group of gunmen about the same size as the group of 11 people that are going to be killed, which should be sufficient. You get different lists of who's involved in it. Some of the names are consistent. I think there were some people later who would claim to be part of the execution squad who were just claiming to be. There are other people who were said to have been who denied it. You'll get all kinds of different stories about this. Most of them are fairly consistent, but it will vary. And there were 2 or 3 people who dropped out before the killings took place. Yurovsky said that when it was explained to them that they were going to have to kill everyone, there were at least 2 men who said that they were not going to be involved in killing women and said, I want nothing to do with it. And he said, okay. You have to be willing to do this. So if you're not down for what we're going to do, then okay, I just release you from it. So, how many actual killers were there on that particular night? Well, there were 10. Maybe there were, get different numbers. There were 10. There were 9. Somebody else said that there were 11. Somebody else added, nobody seems to be keeping careful notes in this situation. And again, I go back to this as a good example of the uncertainty of historical events.
Yeah.
Because keep in mind, Yurovsky has a lot on his mind. And one of the things he's not going to do is be counting everything. So if somebody drops out a day ahead of time or 15 minutes before somebody wanders off into another room, all he's making sure is that he has a group of men who have guns and ammunition and are willing to carry out the killings. And whether there are 11 or 10 or 9 or 5 of them, it's not really going to matter under those circumstances. So basically go to the house that night, on the night of the 16th. It's getting late. Now, here's one of his problems. They want all of this done under cover of darkness. And this is high summer at high latitudes, which means that the sun sets late and it comes up early. So it's not going to be dark until after 10 o'clock. And the sun is going to be well up by 5 a.m., if not earlier. So if you want to get all of this done in darkness where no one is going to see it, you only have a fairly short window of time. So Yurovsky had made arrangements that trucks were supposed to show up at midnight. So the killing was actually supposed to be done before midnight on the 16th. And that's when the trucks were going to show up. But they don't show up. They get delayed. And Yurovsky doesn't want to go through with the killings until the trucks are there to carry the bodies away. And the trucks don't appear to show up until around after 1 a.m. So eventually they rumble in. So it's about that time that they go. And somewhere around 1 a.m. that he goes in, they roust Nicholas or others out of bed and say, look, you're all going to have to be moved. We're going to move you to Perm, or we're going to put you somewhere else. So you have to get all your belongings together as quickly as possible and ascend downstairs in the basement, which isn't an actual basement. It's a kind of daylight basement, but it's the lower sort of semi-subterranean floor of the house. And they're not very quick about it. The descriptions are is that, it's difficult to get the girls out of bed and get their clothes together and find their lap dogs. And they spend about 30 or 40 minutes dicking around, getting their stuff together, and eventually assembling down below. And once they're all there, the whole family and their retainers are sort of in one room. Yurovsky and his men are in an adjoining room, and what's separating them is these kind of large, I think, sort of pocket doors that would open up. So there are 2 rooms which can be basically joined by opening up these doors. He opens up the doors, goes forward and reads the order of execution that he has been given on the authority of the Ural Soviet. So who do we know has a paper who actually ordered the executions? Well, that's the regional Ural Soviet. Remember, this dependable group of Bolsheviks over in Perm. But we know that both Sverdlov and Goloshokin had been in contact with them. There is a reference that on that evening, and the Ural Soviet admits having filled out this order on their authority, but then they telegraph Moscow for confirmation. And a confirmation telegram, according to, I think, Goloshokin or Yurovsky, was received. So what does that tell you?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question comes down to, were the murders carried out purely on the independent authority of the Ural Soviet? Because they're the one, that's the order that Yurovsky is reading. He's not reading an order from Lenin or Sverdlov. He's reading an order of execution, a condemnation to death from the Ural Soviet. But they want this confirmed from Moscow and supposedly receive confirmation. Now, it's not clear confirmation for what, but you would assume that it's confirmation that the murders would be carried out. So that suggests that the ultimate authority is in Moscow. with Lenin or Sverdlov. But this remains a question because there's no document ever to prove that. That telegram has never been found. But I would argue that if ever it exists, somebody just burned it.
Right.
Or there was never one to begin with. I personally have a hard time seeing the Ural Soviet taking that action completely on their own. But it's not impossible. They were zealous, after all. So this is, Nicholas is standing in front of the rest of the family when the execution order is read. His last words, supposedly, a word in this case, was supposedly, "What?" Which sounds complete. Remember, you're still kind of half awake. It's early in the morning. You've been herded down into the basement, and now this guy steps forward and reads the order for your execution. So, did I hear you correctly? What? And then they begin firing, rather wildly. And here again, now Yurovsky, the head of the execution squad, is going to later write 2 different accounts of the murders. The first one appeared in 1920, so a couple of years later. The second one in 1934. They are not identical. There are numerous, they all agree that everyone was killed. We shot them and bludgeoned them or whatever was necessary until they were all dead. He doesn't say that any, but they differ in terms of, the details would be in the first volley, the first set of firing, a number of people were still alive. He tends to agree that on both occasions, Nicholas was killed. He was the first to be killed, probably because he was standing in front. But then in the 2 versions, in some cases, this daughter is dead and this one is still alive. Alexandra is alive or she is killed outright. Did his memory get better over time? Did he change it for some sort of political reason? Did he just wasn't really sure? But here again, the uncertainty of historical events. The guy who's the head of the execution squad, who was definitely there, cannot remember between the 2 versions over exactly who was killed when, other than the fact that he's certain that by the end, they were all dead. Now, another little detail in this, for instance, I'd mentioned before a couple of times that there were 4 dogs among the family. So the daughters and even Alexei had his own. And these are like small dogs, Pomeranians, bulldogs. And one of the dogs, by both of the accounts, and by accounts of other members of the assassins or alleged assassins left their memoirs as well. And they don't agree with each other. And so there seems to be a general agreement that 3 of the dogs were killed, but that 1 was spared. But it's not clear which one.
Yeah.
Whether it was a kind of Pomeranian or was it a bulldog, and whether its name was Joy or Jack. Maybe they just heard the name in some way.
Yeah.
But also, I think in one version, it just sort of hides somewhere. They don't really notice it, and they're too busy to take. Another guy claims that he spared it deliberately, sort of hid it away. But I remember another version where it goes, no, all of the dogs were killed. Well, who knows? No one has ever seen or talked to the dogs since that time. The only thing you agree upon is there should have been 4 dogs. 3 of them were likely killed. One of them, who was either Joy or Jack or this dog or that dog, was spared, but no one is certain. So it's when you begin to dig into the details of this incident, as in so many others, what you find are all of these little variables, the uncertainties. Anyway, they all end up dead. It's now okay. That's what it comes down to. Well, that's important because according to all of there's no one still alive, and which would have the question of how people would show up later. But he could be wrong. Maybe he thought they were lying on the floor bleeding.
Sure,
okay, and he thought they were dead. But from his idea. So the trucks finally show up, and it's around 2 a.m. It's going to be light in a few hours. Supposedly there's been a gravesite already prepared out of town somewhere where they're going to hide the bodies. Now, that's the interesting question. They're going to hide the bodies. Why? I mean, if you're going to make a political statement out of it, why don't you just leave them there? Well, the argument is that, well, they wanted to hide the bodies so that it couldn't become a shrine. Because, again, Nicholas is such a beloved figure that immediately they would become martyrs, and this would be... At the time, no, I don't think that was the case. Right. So that's another point to keep in mind. Why was it necessary to hide the bodies? To make them all disappear so that there was no physical trace. In other words, no trace of whether they were dead or alive. Now, this is like a mass murder organized by the Keystone Cops. Nothing has gone right so far, and then they get lost on their way to the gravesite.
Wow.
Okay, it's dark. Okay, nobody give directions. Somebody and then one of the trucks gets separated, and somebody comes up with the idea, well, I don't know, why don't we just take the bodies and burn them? All right. So supposedly a couple of bodies were taken and burned separately. They're separated from the other ones. But here again, it's not clear whose.
Yeah.
So at one point, I think it's Yurovsky who thinks it was the Empress's, it was Alexandra's body and one of the daughters, but then to find out that no, it wasn't Alexandra, it was the maid Demidova. Okay, her body. You were supposed to burn the Empress and you burned the maid. Well, they all look alike. All right, they're both middle-aged women covered in blood. So what are we going to do? But this is where, in the process, in this kind of chaos which is taking place, the bodies of Alexei, the Tsarevich, and Anastasia are separated from the others. And somehow they're partially burned or buried elsewhere. I've never gotten a clear idea as to why that would be the case. But they are separated. The rest of the bodies are eventually taken to a gravesite, subjected to, there are grenades thrown in, there's acid thrown on them, there's an attempt to destroy the bodies as much as possible, to eliminate any traces of them. But there are those two, the two youngest offspring, are separated from the rest. And now that's the main story of what happens to them. But there's a couple, remember I said that there had also been other members of the larger imperial family that had been gathered in that area. Well, one of those is the Tsar in waiting, Nicholas's brother, Mikhail. Remember, he'd been arrested and he'd been moved, I think, around to the town of Perm in that area. Now, sometime before this, I think in late June, he and his manservant had been killed by local Bolsheviks. And this, again, had been kept quite secret. It was the type of thing is that he and his English manservant, who had been housed together, again, also been sort of royal prisoners, same sort of thing. Group of guys show up in the wee hours of the morning and say, you got to take a train. We got to move you out of here. And we're going to take the shortcut through the woods. Okay. That, by the way, if you ever find yourself in that situation, is a bad sign. Okay. It's 2:00 in the morning. Oh, get dressed.
Shortcut.
We're going to catch a train and we're going to take a shortcut through the woods. And of course, halfway through the woods, as the later description by the killers have put it, Mikhail was shot in the back of the head. His servant was killed. And those bodies were also hidden and have never been found. So their burial place was completely obscured. Shortly after, I think, the killings at Yekaterinburg, other members of the imperial family, including at least one Grand Duke and a couple of princes, were in Alapayevsk, were also taken out and killed, and their bodies disposed of in the same sort of secret way. So there was a kind of settling of accounts in this case. So it's not just the immediate imperial family, but other members, the Romanovs Romanovs that the Bolsheviks had congregated in that particular area are killed over a short period of time. Now, so that then sort of brings us to this question of what the Soviet government eventually announced about this. And let's see.
I mean, in light of everybody being executed at the same time, do you think that signals anything about, even though, the Tsar might be politically powerless at that time, the Soviets might have viewed him and Mikhail, right? That was the brother that was supposedly had more support. I mean, it just it signals that they both were a threat in some ways, and that's why they both were.
Well, that's the general assumption that Nicholas, I'd argue, wasn't a threat to them. Mikhail might arguably have been, and that might also have been why they whacked him first. But Nicholas was certainly more well known. So the killings take place early on the morning of the 17th. By the way, due to all of those complications, it's, I think, something like 50 hours between the actual killings and the disposal of the bodies. Okay, so it takes some time before they all get there. It's a excrement show in terms of how all of this is put together. But, eventually, in the end, Yurovsky performs his duty. So the killings take place on the 17th. The bodies are finally disposed of by the 19th or early on the 20th. And then on the 20th of July, there is an official announcement that appears in Izvestia. It was issued by Yakov Sverdlov, again, Lenin's right-hand man, the guy who presumably was, the fellow who had put Goloshekin and Yurovsky, who would put the whole operation, had gotten the whole thing going. And it was on behalf of the Soviet Central Committee. And in this, Sverdlov explained that owing to the twin threats of the Czechs and a newly discovered counter-revolutionary rescue plot, and that, by the way, had been manufactured by the Soviet secret police to, what they had done is that Chekists, that is, Bolshevik security men, had forged letters from a former friend, a military officer of Tsar Nicholas, by the name of General Dovgart, and had sent these letters, supposedly letters from Dovgart, saying that that Dovgart was the head of a rescue plot and trying to get Nicholas to agree to that. I'm not sure that Nicholas ever agreed to the rest, but he wrote back. He responded, and that's just what was presented as that was the whole basis of the order of execution. Okay. That Nicholas had illegally communicated with a White Guard officer who was heading of a rescue plot, even though those letters never had been sent to them. So he was entrapped into race. So that could then be presented as documentary evidence as to why the executions took place. So that's what Sverdlov is referring to here. A newly discovered counter-revolutionary rescue plot. The Ural Soviet shot citizen Nicholas Romanov on the 16th of July, which, of course, is wrong, but that was the original date that it was to be done. So even that little detail is slightly off. It was supposed to be on the 16th, but it ended up on being the 17th. But that's it. All of this announcement said is that Nicholas Romanov was executed. It says nothing about any other member of the family. Just like the press articles, back in June, Alexandra, Alexei, and the rest of the family, Sverdlov says, were sent to a safe place. So, the official admission is that Nicholas was executed on the orders of the Ural Soviet because of his involvement in a counter-revolutionary plot, but that all the other members of the family are alive and were taken to a safe place. Why do that? What was the point of creating the impression that most of the family was still alive? And that is the official statement. That's it. Okay, everybody else sort of later knows what's going on, but that is what officially is said. Now, so this comes back to this idea, could someone considering all of these different versions of it, get the idea that there were members of the family that survived. Well, the official statement said that they did, all except Nicholas. So that, I think, if you put those clues together, and that's what I'm doing, sort of stated the kind of basic facts, but if you put those clues together, the disguising of the body, the making the bodies disappear, leaving no physical remains, and then making an announcement that all but one member of the family, the Tsar himself, had survived. So there is a deliberate, and I think a purposeful effort on the part of Sverdlov or other members of the Soviet government to create the impression that at least some of them had managed to survive when they knew full well that that was not the case. Now, one could argue that they don't admit to killing the women and the children because they didn't want to look bad, but, that's not, you're talking about Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I mean, he was perfectly willing to accept that if it was necessary. Who were you trying to impress by this? I don't think they were trying to save face. I think they were trying to deliberately create a myth that they could subsequently exploit. Which then brings us to the question of not who, but why. The critical question.
Yeah.
And that gets down to the issue of money. So, Nicholas and his family, the Tsar, and his offspring, and his wife, were controlled a variety of assets. So I'm not talking about state assets, but I'm talking about personal accounts, cash, stocks, investments that were held both in Russia, but also, very importantly, abroad. A lot of those were abroad. So the Tsar had investments in England. There are other bank accounts. How much money that they had is highly questionable. Again, you can never get an exact account on it. Some would argue that it really, in the end, what you would assume that the Tsar of Russia would have, it wasn't that much. But the ones that you can trace is that of the children, that is of the 5 children, there were foreign bank accounts in their names to the value of 25 million, I think, gold rubles. Today, that would be worth roughly $160 million. Now, those are just the accounts for the children in foreign banks, $160 million. People have been killed for much less than that. So one of the things that the Soviet regime did not have was foreign recognition. It was a pariah. The other thing it didn't have was control of any amount of significant assets. Even at this point in time, they hadn't gotten their hands on the remnants of the Russian state gold reserve, which they would very quickly squander once they did. But that was one of the things that they needed to do. Also remember that Lenin's greater goal wasn't simply establishing communist power in Russia. It was what? Well, it was general transformation of the world. Right. It was a universal Soviet republic, which would mean that you would need money abroad in order to fund the revolutionary activities there. So the revolution would have to spread into foreign countries, and it would need monetary assets to do that. The government itself needed money. Much of this money was outside of the area controlled by the Soviets, often in foreign, hostile Western countries, in bank accounts that you knew there were bank accounts in which members of the imperial family had. So the murders were carried out on the 17th, initially supposed to be on the 16th. Let's go back a little bit in time to the 13th of July. And on the 13th of July, Lenin, we know, signed an order. And that order, on behalf of the Soviet government, nationalized all personal property and accounts belonging to members of the imperial family. So anything that existed in their names were now to be taken over by the Soviet authorities. So let's put these things in order. On the 13th of July, Lenin signs an order seizing all the monetary assets of the family. 2 days later, Goloshokin goes to Yekaterinburg and tells Yurovsky that you need to have them all dead within 24 hours, and they are then killed. But the bodies and even the disposition of whether or not all of these people are dead, in fact, the Soviet government will then subsequently deny killing all but Nicholas. And that, I think, in terms of speculation, is the basic secret to the whole thing. It's the reason why they were isolated and why they were murdered and what the plan was. And the plan was to kill them and then subsequently get a hold of the financial assets that they had. And even at this point, it doesn't matter how much money there really was. The point is that Lenin and the others knew there was some money, and there could be much more. I mean, if the kids had accounts worth $160 million, imagine how much else there might be. But you can't get it because it's in foreign banks. So then you get into the realm of the imposters that will appear. I think in some cases, it's just a matter of people being deluded in one form or another. But in other cases, I think it's deliberate. Because how would you get control of those assets outside the USSR? A living claimant shows up.
So is this the myth you were referring to? Because that's kind of where I'm lost or I'm stuck.
Well, the stories immediately began to proliferate that there were survivors of the family. And this runs the gamut. In fact, there was a book that was published some years back, I would say within the last 20 years, called The Rescue of the Romanovs, and it had to do with a story which appeared in a book published in the United States in 1920 in San Francisco, called "Rescuing the Tsar." What else? Which told the story, the supposed story, of the rescue of the entire family. It's like Stephen Alley's rescue mission actually succeeded. And that a British agent, not named Stephen Alley, but in this case called Charles James Fox, managed to get them all out, every single one of them, across Tibet, into China, aboard a British ship, and take them to Ceylon, where they all lived happily ever after, including Nicholas. And this was one of the things, the author of this had assembled a great deal of information. There was a lot of just not conclusive, but odd evidence that almost seemed to support. Now, what it all went back to is this book in San Francisco, Rescuing the Tsar, which was privately published. It can go into, I want to save the whole story for that later because it connects to something else. There's a whole kind of chain of events that go into it. But there's nothing much else to support it. But once the author, Shay McNeil, began looking through all of this, that was a book, The Plots to Rescue the Tsar. That was the name of the book. And, I knew her when she was writing this, and, at no time was I ever convinced that the story was true, but I could see why she believed that it might be true. I could see that once you got the idea in your head that there was a survival, that there were various things that began to fit with it. I think this partly you get into the realm here where you've kind of decided what the story is,
you're trying to...
and now you're assembling information that fits that story. But it would still look to me in a way as if all of this was a deliberate effort to obscure that possibly, to keep alive the notion in the West in particular, by publishing this book in San Francisco, that there were all or some of the family that had survived. And it comes back as to what the basic, why would that matter to anyone? Why would you deliberately create that idea? And the answer I would propose is that you, in order to get control of those assets that you believed were in the West, you needed to produce someone who could claim the account. That's why you need an Anastasia. Because if Anastasia is the sole survivor of the family, she inherits everything. All of that stuff would be, and it doesn't have to be her. It could be Tatiana. It could be Alexei. I mean, all you need is one. If you don't need the whole damn family alive, then you'd have to split everything up. And that's why that story doesn't make much sense. All you need is one to come through and convince a court in America, France, Switzerland, wherever else, that they are the legitimate heir and all of that money is theirs. And then guess who that's going to get turned over to? So that's, I think, the story and the whole thing. That's why the bodies are hidden, so that there are no corpses to keep alive the possibility. And that's in particular why Anastasia and I don't know whether the idea from the beginning was to pick them in particular, although there's an advantage to that. Why? Because they're the youngest. And therefore that can be kept alive longer. Now that, I wouldn't push that too hard, but it does kind of work in that way. So pick the two youngest kids. And that's, if you look at it in terms of the different claimants that show up, the largest number of fakes were fakes Alexei's, even more than Anastasia's. And they would pop up in various places, most of them attracting a little bit of attention, but some of them did. And probably, why don't we pause it here just for a second so I can... So when you actually begin to count up the number of Romanov pretenders, there are, by rough count, at least 20 people who would show up over the years. Again, most of those didn't attract a lot of attention. And that began, in the early 1920s and all the way up through the 1990s. There were 5 fake Anastasias. And I'm saying fake here because I don't think any of them were real, but there were 5 people who claimed to be Anastasias. There were 7 fake Alexeis. But then again, the other members of the family would show up. And in fact, one of the fake Alexeis showed up in the early 1960s, and the guy was under a fellow by the name of whose name was Michael Goleniewski. He was a Polish communist intelligence officer who defected. Okay, to the CIA, and was apparently gave them a lot of very valuable information before he turned weird and began claiming that he was the Tsarevich Alexei.
Need some of that money.
Even though he appeared to be years younger and he was not a hemophiliac. He claimed that if you live long enough, you just got over that.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Which some people claim could be true. But anyway, he was not. Okay, but it was a huge embarrassment.
Yeah.
In terms of the reliability of that individual. But he was, in fact, Goleniewski, at one point claiming to be Alexei, was introduced to another woman named Eugenia Smith, who claimed to be Anastasia, and they had a wonderful, heartfelt reunion where they hugged and recognized each other. So 2 fakes recognized each other. They may both have believed this in their own mind. I mean, that's one of the things you can never be sure of, as to what people may actually believe. But the whole business of Romanov imposters, it isn't just the one who is by far the most famous, the one that got the most attention, Anna Anderson. So later there was a movie, Anastasia, that had Ingrid Bergman in it, and that's basically based upon Anna Anderson's case. And her case is worth looking at because she probably not only became the most famous, but may have come the closest to actually getting her claim taken seriously. So you also have to keep in mind that Anastasia, had she lived, would not only have been the only surviving member of her family and therefore entitled to all the Romanov money, but her mother was part of the German noble family of Hesse, I think Hesse-Darmstadt, and they were quite wealthy as well. So as a senior member of that, she would have been as part of her mom's estate. That's why the most vigorous legal opponents of Anna Anderson's claim to be Anastasia were her supposed German relatives.
Interesting.
Because they were in no intention of sharing a single mark or a euro with her. There weren't euros then, but they went. So Anna Anderson's story is kind of interesting. Her real name, so far as can be determined, was Franziska Szukowska, sometimes Franziska Tchaikovsky. She was Polish, or she came from an area in Germany that after World War I became Polish. She was ethnically Polish. That was later confirmed by DNA comparisons with members of her family. Even in the 1920s, there were members of her family who knew who she was and recognized her. But her story was that it sort of appears in 1920. And she's observed jumping in Berlin. And she's a young woman. She jumps into the Landwehr Canal in an apparent suicide attempt. Police sergeant jumps in, saves her from drowning. She's then taken to a hospital, eventually tours a mental ward. She claims not to know who she is, to have amnesia, and initially makes no claims of being Anastasia or anybody else. She doesn't seem to know who she is. It's another, I think, inmate in the asylum, a woman who had some acquaintance, claims some acquaintance with the Russian imperial family, who noticed the fact that she looks an awful lot like Anastasia. And that's where the story sort of got started, that she was. Now, there is some kind of resemblance, but if you actually do comparisons between them, they never really looked that much alike. I mean, they looked alike if you didn't have them next to each other. They looked alike, and the same sort of general description of a young woman would match. So initially, it's somebody else who says she looks like Anastasia, and then apparently, as it goes, she sort of, without any other clear identity, glommed onto that idea and came to believe that she was Anastasia. And then the games began. Then you would have people who had actual acquaintance with the real Anastasia who would come. There were some, most really, would come and look at her and go, no, that's not her. I know Anastasia anywhere, and that wasn't her. And now keep in mind, the real Anastasia dies when she's 17. So she never grows into a full adulthood. So what she would actually look like as a grown woman is undetermined. And others, however, including the son, I think, of the Tsar's physician, Gleb Botkin, would be one of her chief supporters. So there were people who became absolutely convinced that she was the real Anastasia, and there were others who completely denounced her as a fraud from the get-go. And she, on the other hand, continued to betray, or rather to display, kind of odd, tempestuous behavior. She was known for throwing tantrums. There were some people who thought that she was, well, not to put too fine a point on it, crazy. All right. She seemed to be mentally unstable. She began calling herself, I think, in 1928, she made her first visit to the States. And I think that around that time may have been when she started calling herself Anna Anderson. So she adopted the name Anna because it was short for Anastasia. And Anderson was simply this name that, obscured who she was. She couldn't apparently claim the name Romanov directly. And that became this kind of alias which she used. She would then later return to Germany in the 30s, and for most of the Nazi regime, continued to live in Germany. The Nazi regime never took her claims that seriously either. But she sort of managed to survive the war. She eventually returned to the U.S., I think in the late 40s, married an American doctor by the name of Mahan, and then became Anna Mahan. Towards the end, her strongest, her most vigorous supporters were generally Americans, none of whom, or most of whom, hadn't had any real connection with the genuine Romanovs. But her claim went on for years and years. I think she died in 1984, still claiming that she was Anastasia, and her story was the one that was eventually adapted into the Ingrid Bergman movie. So, and then from there on to the animated film. So remember the myth of the survival of Anastasia has become something sort of embedded, I think, in modern popular culture. So I'm always tempted to say that the Anastasia Disney film, and it wasn't a Disney film. It just looked like a Disney film.
That, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because to me, all animated films look like Disney films. But that shows you how this goes on, and also how that turned Rasputin into an actual demonic figure, which is the kind of general evolution of things in which they take place. Now it goes back. We need to go back in some time here. So Anna Anderson doggedly pursued legal claims in Germany in particular, none of which reached fruition. But they were, so what do I think might have happened in this case? So what you begin with is a kind of mentally ill young woman who roughly matches the description. And I think it may simply have come down to the fact that she didn't know who she was, and someone then in Berlin noticed that she bore a resemblance to Anastasia. Now suppose there was some Soviet representatives in Berlin, where they were in 1920, Karl Radek among them, he was the main figure there, who were looking for someone. Okay, so now you're looking for someone who can impersonate Anastasia or Alexei, whoever it might be. Now, there's two ways you can go about this. You can create someone, an actor, who will impersonate and play the part, but knows that they're not and is always consciously faking it.
Yeah.
Or you can get someone who really believes that they are. That's the way that they would sell it. So find a mentally damaged, amnesiac young woman who bears a resemblance, who doesn't really seem to have much of a past, and then begin to groom her. And one of the things that I found early on, when you would have people who would come and say that they could identify, people who had some acquaintance with the court, that they would often talk to her. They would ask her questions about things like, who was the English baby? Who was this person? And so on. But what they're doing is they're also feeding her information. Because I remember seeing what was supposedly a conversation between Anna Anderson and I can't remember the woman's name, but one of them. And the woman was simply just feeding her this kind of information, which she was then absorbing. And it was also relatively easy on the Bolshevik end of things to get all of the details about the imperial court you wanted, because there were still plenty of people who knew about that. And one of them was a woman by the name of Anna Veryubova, who had been a lady in waiting. She'd also become one of the cronies to Rasputin. He had to help introduce him. She knew everything that went on, all of the kind of details. And the Bolsheviks, for some reason, just let her run free for a number of years before she was allowed to emigrate abroad. So, despite her intimate connection to the horrible Romanov family and her reactionary background, nevertheless, nothing ever happened to her, and she was allowed to go abroad. And that's just one case Vyryubova could have provided every bit of information that someone else basically then grooms and feeds to Anastasia, to give her an identity and to give her all of those details that she might have. It wouldn't be that difficult to do. And I don't think that was done in every case with the imposters. I think some were just imposters. But I would, and this again is speculation, it is my theory, that in Anna Anderson's case, probably, and certainly in some of the others, there was a deliberate Soviet operation to create and foist false Romanovs in the West with the aim of getting their hands on the money. And that's what all of the killings had been about to begin with. They were murdered, and then that murder disguised and obscured with the hopes of gaining their monetary assets. Nothing too mysterious or woo-woo about that, but that, I think, is the real secret to the Romanov killings. But, the story as always doesn't really end there. There's another aspect to this. There's another little side. This was something that I just kind of stumbled on some years ago. I'm certainly looking for something else. And it doesn't involve Anastasia, and it doesn't involve Alexa. It involves the next youngest daughter, Tatiana, who would have been around early 20s, around 22. Now here again, we have to go back to November 1917. Okay, so this is right after the Bolsheviks have seized control. This is when the rest of the Romanov family is still very much alive. I think they're still in Tobolsk in this period. They haven't even been moved to Yekaterinburg. And once again, you start getting articles appearing in the American press. And they begin announcing, the first one on the 26th of November 1917, that the Grand Duchess Tatiana, second daughter of ex-Tsar Nicholas, had escaped Siberia and was on her way to the United States. The story originated from something called the News Bureau of the Russian Post Office Department in New York, which doesn't seem to have actually existed, but we'll see where this actually came from. Now, the author was a fellow by the name of Ivan Narodny. Now, Ivan Narodny was actually a fairly well-known figure in the Russian-American community. He wasn't Russian. He was Estonian. His real name was Jan Sibul, but he used the name Ivan Narodny in his career as a revolutionary. So Ivan Narodny had been an anti-Tsarist revolutionary for years. He wasn't a Bolshevik revolutionary. He was, in fact, one of those more moderate socialists who attached themselves to the provisional government. He basically became Alexander Kerensky's chief propagandist in America during the summer of 1917. So he's connected to the provisional government. And now he's formed this outfit in New York called the Russian Civilian Relief Society. He's recruited other people, Americans and some Russian Americans, into it. And this is the group which has actually released the story that Tatiana, daughter of the Tsar, is on her way to the United States. And Narodny claims that she's coming to America where she's willing to work for the war effort in any capacity. And she's going to make propaganda for free Russia and the Allied cause. And also, she's now become as he describes it, a devout Democrat who dreams of a United States of Russia, and she allegedly begged Americans not to abandon Russia to socialistic adventurers. So this is all part of now remember, Kerensky's just recently been overthrown. He's still in Russia running around trying to gather support. And now you have his chief propagandist in the U.S. claiming that the Tsar's daughter, who is now a real fan of Kerensky, is coming to America where she's going to engage in propaganda and war work. Well, and this, creates quite a stir in the American press. And one of the members of this Russian Executive Committee of America that Rosie holds is an American banker by the name of Charles Carver. And Charles Carver is, among other things, he's connected to the National City Bank, which has large holdings in Russia, a bank that's done a lot of business with the imperial government and elsewhere. Another part of this is a lawyer in New York, Harry Guggenheimer, who had an office in the Equitable Building, and is also connected to banking circles as well. But the thing about Carver is that his wife, Margaret Carver, announces that she is going to become Tatiana's chaperone in America. And she makes a big deal, a big press announcement on how she's heading from New York to San Francisco, where Tatiana is going to arrive in just a few days, and that she will introduce her and become her chaperone as she travels from San Francisco back to New York to resume or to assume her war work once it's there. Now, there are American reporters who go to the Russian consul in San Francisco, where Tatiana is supposed to arrive. The Russian consul there is a guy by the name of Artemy Vovotsev. And he says, I don't know anything about this. I haven't heard anything about it. But he thought that if it was true, he knows that Tatiana was probably coming to the U.S. to look after her father's huge investments in this country. Now, I don't know exactly what Vovotsev would have known about those, but notice that comes up.
Yeah.
Well, if Tatiana's coming here, it must be to look over her father's investments.
Right.
Now, keep in mind, they're all still alive at this point. And Vovotsev said that if she actually did show up, he would treat her no differently than anyone else. On the other hand, what he then did is to turn around and resign as consul. Huh. He quits. Now, there were a lot of people who didn't know quite what the Russian diplomats abroad. So in a matter of months, you'd had people who had served the imperial regime that then woke up one morning and found out that they were supposedly serving the provisional regime. Many did, some didn't. Some quit. Now you wake up one morning and find out that you've got Lenin and the Bolsheviks in charge of things, and a lot of Russian diplomatic representatives wouldn't accept that. So, for instance, the Russian ambassador in America, Boris Bakhmatyev, would remain loyal to the provisional government and never accepted that he would serve the Soviets. So the guy that replaced Vovotsev was a former Russian vice consul from Chicago by the name of George Romanovsky, not Romanov, but
right.
Close enough. Okay, so people would get that confused. So he had become vice consul in San Francisco, and now he becomes consul. But there were accusations that he was actually a secret Bolshevik. No one was quite sure what his political inclinations were. But the really interesting thing to me is that Romanovsky will become close friends with an American in San Francisco by the name of William Rutledge McGarry. Now, we haven't heard of him, so who the hell is William Rutledge McGarry? He was a publicist. He was a commercial propagandist who then worked partly for the British. He became a narrator for British war films during the war. He was connected with a thing called Pan-Pacific Magazine. Generally a kind of low-level schemer and teller of commercial tales. But remember something that I mentioned earlier about that book that appeared in 1920 in San Francisco called Rescuing the Tsar, that claimed that the whole family had gone to live happily ever after in Ceylon? Well, the two people who wrote that book were William Rutledge McGarry and George Romanovsky. They will subsequently, in 1920, concoct this whole Romanov survival story. But notice the fact that in 1917, 3 years earlier, Romanovsky, and eventually McGarry will figure into this, are part of this Tatiana is coming to America. Well, not to leave too much of a mystery, Tatiana never actually shows up in America. But it sets off a number of strange things that do happen. And one of the things that happened is that on the 14th of December, the Hawaiian Gazette reports that a ship, the Shinyu Maru, had arrived from Yokohama. And it was greeted by detectives. American detectives go to the ship because there were two people aboard the ship whose last name was Romanov. Now remember, these news stories had been spreading for almost a month at this point. Now was the idea that they're Romanovs actually aboard this ship that's headed, its final destination is San Francisco, and they're just stopping here. And sure enough, there were two people. There was Hippolyte and Yelena Romanov. Not Anastasia. He was 53 years old. He was an engineer, which, by the way, was not too far off from Nicholas's age. And she was a 36-year-old opera singer, so she was considerably older than the actual Tatiana. Mm-hmm. And the Hawaiian Gazette at this point began to surmise that the whole story about Tatiana escaping from Siberia and coming was some sort of the work of a clever press agent, as they put it, and they were dead on in that one. But Hippolyte and Yelena Romanov told this whole story. When they eventually reached San Francisco on the 19th of December, and she was particularly quite unhappy because she said their whole departure from Japan had been held up for 3 weeks because an American vice consul in Yokohama, a guy by the name of Paul Jenks, insisted that she was Tatiana and was not going to grant her a visa until she admitted it. So eventually, it took them the whole amount of time to convince, 3 weeks, to convince Jenks that she was not the daughter of the Tsar before he let them go on their way. And this seems to have been what sort of screwed up this whole plan that was being created. So eventually, these two people who actually were Romanov, and by the way, that's a fairly common name in Russia. It's not just the name of the imperial family. You know, shake a stick somewhere and you'll get a Romanov. But in the meantime, what was going to happen to what was this whole plan? These Romanovs were not part of the whole story. Well, eventually, another woman shows up in San Francisco, and she was the 22-year-old Maria or Musia Baranovskaya. And she was the young wife of a fellow by the name of Vladimir Baranovsky, and they were also Russians, and they had come from Siberia. Their name was not Romanov. He, in fact, was the heir to one of the biggest munitions fortunes in Russia. The Baranovsky Powder Company was one of the biggest sort of munitions manufacturers in the Russian Empire. And she was an actress, or an aspiring actress. And the interesting thing about Musia Baranovskaya is that she was the same age as Tatiana, and she also did bear a striking resemblance to her. And that, I think, is what the plan was at some point. Is that, and also, by the way, the Baranovskys know Romanovsky and other members, and there's a connection to Ivan Narodny. So this is what I think the whole thing was. They were going to bring her over, and she was going to pretend to be Tatiana. And this would be all the part of this kind of anti-Bolshevik, pro-Kerensky propaganda campaign. And that somewhere in the process, the confusion of them with Yelena Romanova, the other woman, on another ship headed from Yokohama to San Francisco, is what eventually blew the whole game, and it simply collapsed. And maybe it would probably have collapsed of its own weight anyway. But the most interesting thing, if you're following all of these twists and turns, is that you find that the same people who were behind this attempt to create a fake Tatiana in 1917 then go on to create this kind of fake narrative in 1920 about the survival of the entire family. Now, I don't know whether this had any kind of, whether there was any kind of surreptitious Soviet influence in this. McGarry is he seems to be the lead character in this, is dubious in many ways, or whether this was simply a different plan. Remember, it didn't just have to be the Soviets who would benefit by someone able to claim money.
Right.
Anyone who was behind this person manufacturing, sort of the managers of the imposter, would presumably benefit from this as well. But I think that's what, in the long run, explains most of the subsequent magically appearing Romanovs over the decades to follow. Now, I'll finally bring this back to we said there was going to be some woo-woo in here in some case, and this brings us to the matter of the handwriting on the wall. So, one of the things that also appeared early on is that I think it was also in 1920 that you've got the first sort of Western accounts of the murder of the family began to appear. And can you stop for just a second? Yeah. Okay. So in 1920, a British journalist by the name of Robert Wilton published probably one of the first, it claimed to be an account of the death of the Romanov family. All of them. The last days of the Romanovs. And in this, he basically followed the story that had been put together by an official investigation. So let's backtrack a little bit. So the family had been killed. The bodies had been hidden. The remains would not be found. He was going to the 1990s. In fact, the whole matter of DNA and confirmation of everyone wasn't complete until 2009. That's how long this would take before everyone who was counted was satisfied that all the bodies were accounted for and that they could be identified. So this confusion would endure for decades. But the Bolsheviks evacuated Yekaterinburg, and sure enough, a week later, it was occupied by the Czechs and by the White Russians. And the White Russians were under the command of a General Mikhail Dietrichs. And Dietrichs was a monarchist, or he proclaimed himself to be a monarchist. That was what he proclaimed. And Dietrichs wanted to carry out an official investigation into the murder of the imperial family. And Wilton would then later take the basis of that official investigation and use it as the story within his book. But Wilton began to add certain interesting things to it. For instance, one of the things that became a important little detail in his work is, remember that I'd mentioned that the imperial family had been moved to Yekaterinburg in two groups. And the first one had included Nicholas and Alexandra and one of the daughters, Tatiana, as a matter of fact. And that they had arrived in Yekaterinburg on the 30th of April. Now, I'm not sure whether that was old-style Russian calendar or the new, but by one of the others, it was the 30th of April. And that itself, Wilton thought, was significant in a way, because it comes down to, what is the significance of the 30th of April? Well, it's the 30th of April and the 1st of May. It's one of those important dates on the occult calendar. The 30th of April is Walpurgis Night, the traditional celebration of the witches. The 1st of May, May Day, is Beltane. So it is a traditional day. It has great significance in both in witchcraft and in occultism. And so that is seen as a date of significance. And it's Well, also the 1st of May is the day chosen as the Soviet Christmas. Okay, that's international late. It was that before that was one that they embraced. But it's on the 30th of April. So one of the things that was discovered in the Ipatiev house, where the Romanovs were taken, was that in apparently Alexandra's handwriting, she had scribbled on the windowsill of her room, and she had dated it the 30th of April, and it included a leftward-facing backwards swastika.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't think Nazis here. It's going in the other direction. That's been used. But that, again, was a mystical symbol. Yeah. So, on the 30th of May, on Walpurgis Night, the traditional celebratory day of European witchcraft, the Tsarina puts a good luck symbol, an occult symbol, on the windowsill. Now, supposedly, are other parts. There's also supposedly the words S-I-M-P, which no one is quite sure. Well, no one's quite sure whether those actually existed. One idea is that it's a French phrase meaning the superior unknown master Philippe, which was a reference to one of her occult mentors before Rasputin came along. But it's unclear. But Wilton seems to argue that, yes, she actually did record the date, and she left a swastika. And what did he think was the significance of this? Well, Wilton argued that was a sign of Alexandra's obsession with what he called Kabbalistic signs, her predilection for Kabbalistic signs, and her dabbling in black magic. Now, Alexandra did have an interest in what could be called popular occultism of one form or another. Whether she ever dabbled in black magic or had any particular interest in Kabbalistic signs, however you wanted to design them, is probably fanciful.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, Wilton had picked up on this idea. Okay, it's fair to say this. The Empress Alexandra had some interest in the occult, which could have included dabbling in black magic. That can't be ruled out. But he saw all of this as significant of something. Now, what I want to do is then to draw attention back to something I mentioned at the very beginning about, much later, Jean Parvulescu's idea that there was something, well, occultish about the whole Russian Revolution, and that there was the element of ritual sacrifice which was involved in the death of the Romanovs. Okay. And this is kind of the story that Wilton is beginning to weave in this book as far back as 1920. Now, one of the things that it turns out is that a leftward-facing swastika, a reverse swastika, was a symbol at the time used by a secret society called the Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk. And the Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk was a group of monarchist Russian officers who had supposedly dedicated themselves to rescuing Tsar Nicholas and his family. So remember that whole thing about how the Bolsheviks themselves later concocted letters about a plot? Well, that's what they were basing it on. The group seems to have existed. There was something it called itself the Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk, but how big it was and whether it had ever actually tried to organize any kind of rescue is unknown. And one of the most questionable things about it is that the representative of this group that Alexandra had been in contact with, why she might have left their symbol on the windowsill, was a guy by the name of Boris Soloviev. Thoroughly disreputable guy. Guess who he was married to? Rasputin's daughter.
No!
Yes, Rasputin had a daughter, Maria, who, by the way, would die in Hollywood in 1977. But that's another story entirely. And so Boris Soloviev had approached Alexandra as a representative of this supposed, Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk, and she had given him jewelry. She had passed him jewelry to supposedly fund this operation, which would rescue them. He was a total fraud. He simply sold the jewelry, and furthermore, he informed everything that he was told to the Bolsheviks. He was a Cheka spy, pretending to be the member of a monarchist group. So this is how dubious the loyalties of people to this can be involved. He was also a horrible, horrible husband to Rasputin's daughter. So, and that goes on. And he died miserably of tuberculosis in Paris in 1926, which is, there's a whole story with this guy, but this guy is scum of the earth. So,
Okay.
But nevertheless, Alexandra trusted him, which was a mistake there. Now, the whole story about the Tsarina's inscription has been kind of repeated and popularized in other sort of literature as time has gone on. So, for instance, it makes an appearance in a French book published in the early 1930s called The Seven Heads of the Green Dragon.
I feel like
where now it's turned into, the Green Dragon is like I don't know, it's like Fu Manchu meets the Illuminati. It's the only way I can possibly. It is a work of fiction, but it's one of those works of fiction that many people have taken as being actually harboring a secret meaning. It's fiction, but it's fiction which is telling the truth.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's fiction. And it's not even that good of a story, but it's it sort of incorporates these little bits and pieces of things that are legitimate. Now, so General Dietrichs is in control of Yekaterinburg, and there are no bodies anywhere around. There are all kinds of stories from locals. There were people who actually saw what was going on. And there's also something else you have to keep in mind about the Ipatiev house, is that after the killings took place, the house was vacated, and then it became a kind of tourist location. Locals wandered in and out of the place. Also around Yekaterinburg, there were Austrian and German prisoners of war. Some of them seemed to have come and squatted in the place when it was empty. There was a large empty house. There's a war going on. People would come and stay there. It's noted that the walls in many areas were covered in graffiti. All kinds of, so there was no control over this. You had no idea who had come in. So there's no way to tell what was written or when it was written. And there's actually, as far as I can tell, no way to demonstrably be sure that this inscription on the windowsill was ever written by Alexandra or not.
Yeah.
People would look at it and go, it looks like her handwriting, but it could have been anyone. And there's mentions the fact the walls being covered with graffiti, but they're actually only paying attention to those things that seem to have some kind of significance. So, for instance, something else that was found on the wall was a line from a poem by the German poet Heinrich Heine. And it's in German. Okay, some argued that it was in Yiddish. No, it's not Yiddish. It's German. And the poem derives its story from the book of Daniel, which recounts the murder of King Balthazar by his servants. Except in this case, it's written, and keep in mind, this is written in German. It's not written in Russian or in Cyrillic. It's written, the name is spelled Belsatzar, Beltzazar, which Wilton and Dietrich thought was very significant, that the name had been changed to incorporate Tsar, which Dietrich insisted was a definite sign that this was all part of that this had been written as a kind of gloating gesture to the murder of the Tsar and his family. And all it basically said is that, here on this particular day, Balthazar has been murdered by his servants. So again, it's a line that comes from a poem that had been published long before. How did it appear there in German? Well, again, there were plenty of Germans in the town. That wouldn't have been that unusual. There may have been one or two German POWs, even in Yurovsky's group of assassins or gunmen, however you prefer to refer to them. And it could have been anybody. German was widely known among educated Russians, so who knows who wrote it there and for what purpose. Dietrichs, however, decided that this all fit into his idea that not only were these all signs of that a ritual murder had taken place, but that it was, wait for it, a Jewish ritual murder.
Wow.
This was the work of the Jews who had killed the Tsars to avenge him for all of the persecution that they unjustly accused him of conducting against them, even though it wasn't an unjust accusation. He may not have been personally to blame for it, but there was plenty of Jewish persecution that took place within the Tsarist regime. That is, Russian Jews had a legitimate beef against the imperial government, which isn't to say that most or all of them were disloyal. But there might be some who would have a very good reason for hating it, but there's nothing really to connect that with a line from Heinrich Heine's poem. But this was what Dietrich wanted. Dietrich is the guy who's controlling the whole subsequent investigation, or Dietrichs, I should say. He believed that the Tsar and his family were killed as part of a Jewish ritual murder to inaugurate the bloody Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevik regime.
Yeah.
So it was all Jews that were head of all of this. And he was going to collect any kind of information, legitimate or illegitimate, that would support that.
And he's the French right-winger? Is that...
No, that's not...
Okay.
Dietrichs is the White Russian commander. In
Okay.
He becomes one of the major White Russian figures in Siberia.
Okay.
I mean, I think he'll, continue operating for years.
Okay.
But let's put it this way. He was a convinced anti-Semite, and he had a very definite idea about who was behind the murders, and he wanted any subsequent investigation to substantiate that. Now, that wasn't the only thing that was scrawled on the walls. There were also various numbers that were there, and Wilton mentions those. So, for instance, there was the number 24678 Rus, R-O-U-S, of the year 1918. Someone had written that. Nearby was the number 148467878 Rs. I think that's almost certainly a reference to rubles. Then there was another number, something like 184888. I can't remember. It's 6 number with an R. So the best assumption is it was someone figuring out numbers, figuring out rubles or doing some sort of counting. Other marks, some people who looked at them, it looks like someone sort of testing a fountain pen. So I got to keep in mind, at this time, you didn't have Bics.
Yeah.
You had fountain pens. You dip them in ink. And then once you did that, to get it where it would write, you would make some marks in order to get the ink down so it wouldn't blot. Yeah. So that really, I've seen some of these, is what the marks look like to me. They look like somebody testing a fountain pen. And nevertheless, Wilton, who knew nothing about Kabbalistic symbols, as far as I can tell, would take the word for others that all these marks, these kind of hen scratches on the walls, these are all Kabbalistic, or they're all Hebrew characters. They're not Hebrew characters. The 4 characters that are the most suspicious, and this is where I wish we had visuals, but you can find them. They're not Cyrillic. I'm not sure they're characters at all. They look like an S and a backward S and a backward Y and a slash. I mean, oddly enough, they look like Latin letters, which I guess isn't that surprising. Or they just look like someone, practicing writing with a fountain pen. But I do find it interesting. But it doesn't spell anything. They're not Hebrew letters. The closest they look like are Latin letters. None of them are Cyrillic letters. That is, they're not part of the Russian alphabet. But there was a guy who in 1923, under the name Enel, actually I think this was a French writer, but then who wrote in the name of Verny. So the story seems to first show up in France, and then it's republished in Russian in Yugoslavia. Okay, story there as well. But he decides that what all of these marks mean is that they were part of, and I quote, a secret Persian alphabet, which meant, here through the secret forces, the Tsar has been offered in sacrifice so that his country will be destroyed. All peoples are informed of this event. Now, as far as I can tell, this secret this secret Persian alphabet he's talking about are those 4 characters. Those are the
All
only ones I
that?
ever see represented.
Wow.
All of that in 4 characters. That's the secret, apparently.
What a great alphabet.
So what do I think's going on here? I think people are making stuff up.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember, that's sometimes the most obvious answer that no one wants to come to, that they're just making stuff up because it suits the other story that they've already decided what would happen. But again, it's essentially a lot of scribbling of numbers and other marks that seem to have no kind of obvious meaning, but which Wilton, in the publication of his book in English, popularized as being somehow proof of an occult, sacrificial background, and also a Jewish ritual murder involved in the death of the Romanovs. Yeah. That's where the whole idea comes from. But also remember, there was no control over the environment. Many people had gone through there. Yeah. Other people had lived there. No one has any idea when these things were written. They could have been there before. They could have been written after the murders. They could have been written during it. Who knows? So Dietrich's investigation kind of gets off to a strange start. There are actually 3 different people who are involved in it. The first 2 investigators, are brought in very briefly, are both quickly removed because both of them had backgrounds in criminal investigation. And the first thing they noted is that, well, we don't have any bodies. And if we don't have any bodies, we can't prove that there were any murders. No body, no murder. Right. We've got people who saw they thought were bodies loaded into the back of trucks that were carried off in the middle of the night. There are other, there's the statement from the Soviet government that they killed Tsar Nicholas, but the others are still alive. So if we don't have any bodies, we can't make any kind of statement about this. Dietrich didn't like that. Why didn't he like it? Because he, for his own reasons, wanted them all dead in order to substantiate, you can't have a Jewish ritual murder if there are no murders. Right. Okay. They have to kill somebody. Therefore, they must all be dead. This is a horrible, horrible thing which happened. And I need evidence that would substantiate that they're all killed. Yeah. So the first 2 investigators are removed and also supposedly disappear. I don't know whether, I suspect they probably went somewhere else, but that was the story that was later told, that they were removed and presumably Dietrich had them killed in order to keep them quiet about something they knew. But eventually he finds an investigator, Nicholas Sokolov, not to be confused with Boris Soloviev. This is Nicholas Sokolov. And, he has some background as at least in judicial procedure. But Sokolov completely buys into the idea that the whole family has been killed. Mm. And he writes up his official report, which is called the Sokolov Report, in which that is his conclusion. And actually, he describes what happens fairly accurately. I mean, even though Sokolov is being pressured by Dietrich's to manufacture a story, Sokolov's story appears to be the right one. Now, the other guys weren't wrong when they said you can't substantiate murders if you don't have bodies, but Sokolov just argued, I'm going to ignore that point, and I'm going to go by all the circumstantial evidence, and we'll be able to demonstrate that. Sokolov eventually, through many travails, would end up in Paris. He would have his report with him. That, again, is what Wilton would base the story in his English language book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, and it would gain currency. But there's a final element to this, which has a little final element of mystery and irony in it. Now, one of the people who became very interested in nefarious Jewish plots in the early 1920s was, well, Adolf Hitler. But besides that, even more than Adolf Hitler, the man that Adolf Hitler admired, Henry Ford.
Oh, no. See, I was going to go
So remember, Henry Ford,
yeah,
take a long story and make it as short as I possibly can, had become convinced of evil Jewish machinations in the world. had become a believer in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and therefore, and in fact had bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which published the whole thing called the International Jew, which was essentially a combination, which could simply be called bad stuff about the Jews.
I thought that was the one that he stuffed in all the Model Ts, but then I heard somebody say...
well, you could get, if Ford dealerships carried, you could get buy a Ford, you get a lifetime subscription.
I heard that they put the protocols of the Elders of Zion in the Model T like glove box, but then I've heard the
he didn't international, but it was a series of articles.
Okay.
So Ford was interested in this, and so in 1924, Nicholas Sokolov gets on a boat and sails across the Atlantic and lands in Boston and takes all of his raw materials of the report to the Ford Motor Company. And that's what his entry shows. He comes in, his whole passage is being paid by the Ford Motor Company, and he's going to Dearborn, and he's going to show Ford, or rather Ford's representatives, his underlings, all of the materials he has which seem to substantiate a Jewish ritual murder of the Romanovs. Now, here's the interesting little detail. Sokolov doesn't travel alone. He travels with a couple, a couple by the name of Nicholas and Nadia Orloff.
Okay.
They also have their passage paid by the Ford Motor Company. Now, I'd actually run into Sokolov's dealings with Ford before, but one of the things that I had ignored, and see, this is where you always have to pay attention. If you're looking at travel records of people, at passenger lists, always pay attention to whose names appear next to that person. Look and see if they're traveling with someone and who those people are. Most of the time it's not important, but in some cases it is. So who were Sokolov's traveling companions going with him to the Ford Motor Company headquarters? Well, Nicholas Orloff was a member of a very prominent Russian noble family. And his wife, Nadia, or Nadezhda, what was her maiden name? Romanov. And yes, she was a member of the imperial family.
Huh.
Her father, and she gives her father's address in her immigration entry, your nearest relative in the country from which you came, was, she just gives his name as Peter Romanov, but he's the Grand Duke Peter Romanov. He's Tsar Nicholas's cousin.
Interesting.
So now you've got Orloff, who's married to a member of the imperial family, and that's partly why I think they're there, trying to substantiate, trying to back up the story by having a real Romanov along for it. But there's also something else. The kicker on all of this is, who else was Nicholas Orloff working for? The Soviets.
What?
For years, he was one of their main paid informants in Russian monarchist circles in France and in America.
Interesting.
So the guy who's traveling along with Sokolov, carrying the secret investigative reports to Henry Ford, is keeping the Kremlin involved of everything that happens. I don't know what that could have entailed, but there they are.
Interesting.
What does that mean, if it means anything? And in that case, or on that point, we'll end it there.